Hello, I'm Dr. Dave Rich, President of Geotech Computer Systems. I'd like to thank you for taking the time to look at our company and our software, and we appreciate it. Thank you. Geotech's product line starts with the Enviro data management tool for building and working with environmental and similar data. Our Enviro Space tool is an extension to ArcGIS to display your data on GIS maps. Enviro Cloud lets you implement the software either locally on premises or in the cloud. Enviro Portal is a tool that helps you build websites to display your data either as maps, graphs, or tables. So we've been doing this since 1986, helping our clients manage their environmental data. I even wrote a book on managing and displaying environmental data. We try real hard to keep our customers happy. Some of our clients have been using it all day, every day for over 20 years. We have strong industry relationships with particularly laboratories, but also vendors with complementary software to help our clients work through the bigger world of their data. And we are a woman-owned small business. Not too long ago, we got a PO from the EPA Region 3, and both the woman-owned and the small boxes were checked. Our client base ranges from government agencies of all sizes, industrial companies like petroleum, mining, and so on, and then environmental consulting and contracting companies, which is really our biggest type of client, from some of the biggest on down to individual users for the software. So looking at the high-level view, there's two parts to Enviro data, the editor and the viewer. The editor is where you build your databases. There's a sample planning tool that you can create your sample events. Importing the data is a wizard-based system for getting the data in cleanly and getting it in quickly. And then there's the EPA CLP Level 3 type data validation tool if you need to do that. Then you take off your editor hat, you put on your viewer hat, and you go to select the data that you want, and then choose your output, reports, graphs, limit comparison if you want to get your data out in a way that's most useful. Or you can export or connect to other software. It could be as simple as an XYZ file for Surfer, or also you can export to agencies and so on with that. Looking at the kind of the way the whole thing is laid out, there's two ways you can implement it. One is local. The cool term now is on-prem. That would be the user interface is running on each user's computer, and the data can be on an individual computer, or it could be more commonly on a server, either a file server with data stored in Microsoft Access or a SQL server background, or you can implement the whole thing in the cloud. The user interface runs on virtual machines in the cloud, and the data, again, can be an Access or SQL server. Now we're going to look at the Enviro data software. There's two parts to Enviro data. The first one is the editor, where you build your databases. And then the other one is the viewer, where you display your data, select and display your data. So in the editor, on the left, there's a learning panel. We have a goal of making our software available to all different user skill levels. It could be the person that's coming in from the field. They shake the mud off their boots, they load their data, they make their reports, and then they go back out in the field. Or on the other extreme, we have clients who have users that are database administrators. I picture them as walking around in white coats and clipboards, and it'll satisfy that whole range of user skill levels. So to do that, we have a couple of different things. Now, first of all, up at the top, you see the tour. So you can run this tour, and in a couple of hours, it'll walk you through loading the data, making reports and graphs and so on. And we recommend that. And then the learning panel, once you've got it up and running, there's about 700-page documentation, but of course, no one will read that. So instead, most will use this 20-page Getting Started cookbook. We have a well-documented lab file format. It's straightforward, but very comprehensive. We have a button to email us for help. We maintain a frequently asked questions area on our website. So it's intended to make it as easy as possible for people to learn and use the software. Now, the software can make as many databases as you want. You can, whether you're in SQL or in Access or a server database. We have clients that have literally hundreds of Enviro data databases. or you can make one big database that can have lots of projects in it. Either way, you make your database, and then the next thing you're going to want to do is manage lookups. Now, the lookups or valid value lists are data that constrains the data in the primary tables. And so that would be, for example, sample matrix just has a code and a value. Parameters are a little more sophisticated one, where a parameter can have a name, a short name, potentially a chemical abstract service number, a bunch of other attributes of it. The software can automatically convert to consistent units at either import time or at retrieval time. You can have results of the same parameter by multiple methods. So maybe you're getting naphthalene by both 8260 and 8270. The software knows how to handle that, both at import and when you go to make your table at the end, it'll know to put the 8260 on the volatiles and the 8270 on the semi-volatiles. The next thing, and it's not exactly a lookup, is the regulatory limits. Some people call them maximum concentration levels. And these limits, you can have as many limit types as you want. So you might have a federal standard for this, or state standard for this, or risk-based residential, or so on. And then under each of those types, you can have as many limits as you need. And it's by parameter and matrix, and then also what limit type it is. And when we go to retrieve the data, we'll see examples of comparing results to multiple regulatory limits at one time. The next thing you might want to do is use the sample planning tool. And at the top is the sample plan. And then underneath that are sample events. And you set up the stations you want, the QC, methods and parameters. And then you can create container labels. You can create chains of custody. We'll just look at one real quick here. And so you can, of course, have as many chains as you want for each event. And it tells you things like the methods and parameters for that event, as well as information about the samples themselves. Then the next thing you're going to want to do is import your data. And the import wizard has two goals. Get the data in cleanly, which means the quality you got from your data provider or better, and get it in quickly, which means easily overcome or avoid common problems. So we're going to choose this particular format. We have a bunch of different import formats, and you can make your own. And we're going to choose this file called unsuccessful import, which has an error in it. It's going to help us fix that. And then there's a bunch of configuration you can do. Now, most people never look at this. They just choose their file and go until something changes. And then there's a lot of control over how you get the data in and things that get done as part of that process. So, for example, calculated parameters. Say you get a file that has maybe BTEX, benzene, toluene, ethylbenzene, xylene, and you want to have a record for total BTEX. Your regulator wants that or whatever. You can set up a calculation to calculate that. Or maybe you come in from the field with a depth to water and you want to know the water level elevation for your potentiometric surface map. You can set up that calculation, and every time you bring in a file that has a depth to water, it'll automatically calculate your water level elevation and a bunch of other things along those lines to maximize the quality and usability of the data on the way in. So then once you've made these choices, I click on Finish. It takes a second or two, and it takes that file and it brings it in and it runs it through the ringer. And here it's run into a problem. At this site called Refining Inc., there's no station called MW14. Now, I could add a new station. I could add all the stations in the file. I could add aliases. We have aliases for both stations and parameters. But here it is. It's there. It just has a dash in it. So I do that, confirm the change. Yes. Takes a second or two. All your data was handled successfully. Now, suppose something goes wrong. The lab sends you a file and they say, don't even import it. I don't know, it's got the wrong detection limits or something. You can go in here and undo an import. People love undo. So I go in here and I undo a previous import. And here's the one I just brought in. And I could just go in here and say, undo this import, and it goes away. Now, once your data has been imported, then you might want to perform a data validation on it. It could be as simple as just checking holding times, or it could be a full National Functional Guidelines type validation. And we support validation for EPA, Department of Defense, Department of Energy, states, and things like that. But in this case here, we're just going to go to the Validate Data tool. And here I've loaded a bunch of data from one sample delivery group. And I go over here and I tell it what QC tasks I'm going to run. So I'm going to check field blanks and field duplicates and matrix spikes and that sort of thing. By checking these boxes, you can actually have programs with different tests for different types of data. And then you run the automatic flagging, and it'll do that for you. And then I go over here to validated analyses, and this is what it did. So here's the raw data that's coming in, including things like the QC codes and that sort of thing. And then I go over here, and you can see I have the values and such. And then it is assigned temporary validation codes for the data based on what it found. So for example, here we have some data that failed a matrix spike. We have data that failed, up here we have other kinds of failures here, method blanks and so on. And so this would be the result of that validation. There's also quite a number of reports and other outputs to get the data out of the validation in as useful a way as possible. And then at that point, the validation information for the data goes and joins the data over in the main tables. So that's basically what it takes to build your databases. Now we're going to go from there into building the data in the editor to viewing the data. And again, there's a tour there. We're going to put it away. And then again, that same learning panel here. Now, most of the retrieval is done through this data selection, display options, and output type. There's one couple of other things, though. Over to the side, there's this tree view, which is like a drill down into, we have 3 sites or projects in this database. Here's Rad Industries. Let's go down and we'll choose a couple of these. We'll go down to, say, MW3. Find it. MW3. And so MW3 has a bunch of stations and samples in it. So here is the groundwater data, and we could see here, for example, that sulfate was 258 milligrams per liter. So the user's sitting at their desk, client calls up and says, what'd sulfate do at MW3? A couple of mouse clicks, they can answer that question. So different ways of slicing and dicing the data to make it as usable as possible. But most of the retrieval is done through this select data process. So here's the hierarchy of the database: sites, stations, samples, analyses. So I'll choose a site. Then I go down here and I say, once I've chosen a site, let's say, for example, Rad Industries. And I can set over here, if I type in, turn on auto update, it'll tell me how many I have of each thing. So I have one site selected, but if I go to stations, it'll just take a second or two, and then it tells me I have 177 stations at Rad Industries. But let's go down and just choose a couple of them. Let's say MW1. Oh, where you go? MW1. And the middle one adds it. So we'll go to MW3. So now I have 2 stations selected. You can also set up groups of stations. Maybe you have some stations that are on the factory site, maybe some are in the neighborhood. As long as you maintain those, you don't have to remember what's where. You can just use the groups. We also have sample groups and parameter groups. So now we'll go to the next level, which is samples. And again, there's the group. If you did sample events, it'll allow you to choose by the events. Or I'm going to go here to a date, and I'm going to type in 90. Suppose, for example, that the client says, what were the sample dates for these 2 locations for 1990? I want to know if it was before or after the big rain. So I have these 9 samples in here, and I go to list. And sure enough, here it is. I just highlight these columns, copy it to the clipboard, paste it into an email. Or maybe somebody says, what were all the wells that ever had sulfate greater than 1,000? I can go in and select the results with sulfate greater than 1,000, go to the stations list, and here they are. Just different ways of getting at your data to make it as useful as possible. Now we'll go to the next and final level, which is analyses. And let's choose one. Let's, for example, choose sulfate. I drop the list, go here and find sulfate. I have 5 results for sulfate for that year, but that's no fun. Let's go to all time and make a graph. So I take a second or two. Would you like to display regulatory limits? Yes. convert to consistent units. Yes, these can be set to always, never, or ask. And here's my graph. You can do one parameter, multiple locations, one location, multiple parameters. Just a couple of mouse clicks, we can see sulfate's doing great. Now, if you want to make a lot of graphs, I'll show you later on how you can easily make hundreds in just a few minutes. Now, I love graphics, but most people get the software for their reporting. And a lot of times you have to report the same thing over and over again. So I'm going to take what's on this select data form here, and I can save it under a name like Dave Sulfate Graph, and then bring it back up again later on. Or I can take one that I've already saved, like this one, which has one station all time for a list of parameters, and I can go to the report tool. So the report tool has about 50 or 60 different report layouts. Here's a statistical report. A lot of them are just things that people have needed over the time, different layouts. Now you can store in the database, you can store in addition to your field and lab data, you can store geology, lithology, well construction, station maintenance. So here's an example of a simple boring log that the clients made of the lithology and geology under the samples that they took. So I'm going to scroll down just to give you an idea how many of these things there are. And then I'm going to go down to pick a particular one. And has 9 graphs on a page. And these graphs are can either be by station or by parameter. And then it'll bring them up to you depending on how you have it all laid out. It'll do that. So on that one, interesting story. We have a client that's a Native American tribe, and they have one of the guys called me up and he said, my EPA project manager is driving me nuts. And I said, Curtis, what's the problem? And he said, she wants me to graph all my data. Well, I said, no problem. We got it all in the database. He said, you don't understand. Every location, every parameter, 900 graphs. It took me 3 months to do it last year in Excel. So we fired up a WebEx back then, and I showed him how to select all his data. He ran this report, printed it to a PDF, and sent it to his project manager in 10 minutes. So that's my best time savings ever, probably. Is going to be 3 months down to 10 minutes. But I'm going to run another one of these. More commonly, you're going to get something like this periodic regulatory report with limits. So this is a crosstab table, samples across, parameters down. And so here's the sample information. Down the side is the parameters. And then you can see here that I have a result. For example, up here, oops, sorry, I have a 1.0, less than 1.00. So that means that the result probably came from the lab with a U flag for undetected and a detection limit of 1.00. But in this case, the client wants to see it as less than 1.00, and that's the way most people would do it. Or if they're in Florida, Florida DEP wants to see the detection limit followed by the U flag. Or talking about flag data, we have one down here, 6.60 BJ. So it was an estimated value, probably detected in the blank. And then the last thing is you notice these trailing zeros on both the BJ flag and the non-detects. Enviro data knows how to handle that. Microsoft doesn't like trailing zeros. Go into Excel, type in 1.00, press enter, and they go away. You can format them back on, but Enviro data takes care of that. We make sure that the labs are giving us the correct trailing zeros. We count them on the way in and offer to put them back on the way out. Now, the way you set all this stuff up is in these display options. And again, most users don't come into these detailed forms here. They just run it the way it is. But there's things like, how do you want to handle the flag data? How do you want to handle large numbers? Do you want to go to above a certain level, go to exponential notation or something like that? So the user gets this just the way they want. And also, we're going to display regulatory limits. And so you set this up, and you can have multiple sets of these for different types of reports and displays. Now, we showed you the reporting tool, and this makes reports where the format of the report is predefined, and then the data goes into that format. But what we found was that pretty much everybody needs a different layout for their report. And that's where we go into the export, and I'll show you that in a minute. But the exports actually have 3 kinds of exports. There are exports to go to software. So for example, XYZ file might be to go to Surfer for contouring, or you might want to go to out to Pro UCL, a free EPA environmental statistics program for non-parametric statistics. Or the next category would be for agencies. Scribe is a way to get data to the EPA, various different state agencies, and so on. And then the last category of exports is for people. And that's what the crosstab wizard is. So we're going to make a table. It's actually going to put a table in an Excel file, and we're going to have columns across the top, rows down the sides, and in the middle, we're going to put this formatted value and flag. So that's that less than 1.00 or 6.60 BJ or something like that. And you can have as many of these layouts as you want. So people might say, no, you have to have the parameters across the top and the sample down the side. Well, we have a layout that's like that. We just took what was in the row fields and put them in the column fields. So very flexible. People really love this way of setting up their exports in tables. And then we can specify our grouping and formatting. For example, we're going to break this out by summary category. So we'll have our volatiles together and our metals together and all that. And you can set up some statistics. For example, here I'm going to do some count, maximum, minimum, that sort of thing. And then once you've told it everything you want to do, you just go over here and you say finish. It takes a second or two, and it just wants a file name. I'm going to choose one I already have, crosstab test. I say save. Yes, I do want to replace it. It takes a second or two. Convert to consistent units, yes. Regulatory limits, yes. And then it outputs it to Excel and then brings up the Excel sheet for us to look at. And this, for most of our clients, this is the end result of their data management work, is a table like this. I've been told about 80% of the data that comes out of Enviro data comes out in something like this. So we have our sample information across the top, our parameter information down the side, and then here's our flag data like the less thans and the BJs. And then we have here 4 regulatory limits. You can have up to 12, but then there's no room for your data. And we're going to compare each of our results to all 4 of these. So for example, something that fails the federal MCL is going to have red bold. Now it would also have a red background, but we've also said that something that fails the safe drinking water standards gets a magenta background. So this poor guy here has failed 2 different regulatory limit types. So it does that for all the data in there. And then over on the side, I had promised we're going to do some statistics here, minimum, maximum, arithmetic mean, geometric mean, standard deviation, all that stuff. So this is pretty much the end of the Enviro data management process. So let's take a second now and look at Enviro Space, more than a second, which is the Enviro GIS tool. So I've just switched over from the database into ArcGIS. And in ArcGIS, there's 2 ways of displaying the data. There's layout view, which has your borders and title blocks and things like that. And then there's data view, where we actually work on our map. So we're going to go there. And so as you'd expect, these are the layers that we put in there. And you can, anything you can do, we're in ArcMap. So anything you can do there, you can do here. But for example, I don't want the air photo. It gets a little busy. I had exported some data as an XYZ file to Surfer from Golden Software. And then I gridded and contoured it and then brought it in as shape files for the contours. We don't do any contouring, but it works with lots of tools that do. And then the vector map is where we got the base map from. And then I also had brought up some arsenic values here, which are little colored dots based on the value, and also shows the flag data. So this one here, you can see it's a non-detect because it's less than 0.06. And then I also, Enviro data at its heart is really just the database. So I had done a direct connection query from ArcGIS into the stations table in Enviro data and used the station type to determine the symbols. So the brown squares are soil borings, the blue triangles are monitoring wells, and so on. Somebody that knows how to do ArcGIS could do something like this in just a minute or two. But people looked at this and they said, well, I don't really want to, let me get rid of the stations. I don't want just the stations here, or even just an arsenic value. I want little data streamers next to the locations. Now I'll turn the stations back on. And so that's where the Enviro Space tool comes from. And up at the top here, you can see there's a set of icons. And each one of these takes you into a wizard that asks a bunch of questions about where's the data going to come from, how do you want to draw it, and so on. Some of them have just one wizard screen, some have more than one. And the end result of each of these, we'll start with the simple callouts. So these are callout boxes, which are kind of like you'd expect. I can click on one of these and move it around. The background color of the box can be based on your station group. So maybe the factory site wells could be tan and the neighborhood wells can be green and so on. We're showing our non-detects and such over here, the flag data. We're also showing the exceedances have been highlighted in red here. So this is basically one parameter per line. So people looked at that, they said, that's cool, but I don't want just one sample in there. I want multiple samples and multiple analytes. And that's what the crosstab callouts do. That's much harder to do in ArcGIS. Most people do it by making little tables in Excel and hoping to paste them at the right place on the map. And so there's two kind of ways of doing a crosstab. This one's parameters across, samples down, or you could do vice versa. And here for the samples, we have the dates, but they could also be depths. And this is probably the main reason people get EnviroSpace, and in some cases, even Enviro data, to be able to make these displays. For the water people, we can do stiff diagrams, little double graphs, cations on one side, anions on the other side. Great way to identify water populations in the subsurface. If you're doing geology data, here we've drawn little boring logs on the map, concentrations on one side, lithologies on the other side. So this is, you can look at this and say, oh, look, all the high values are in the fines. Another one you can do is these radar plots. We'll turn off the stick logs. And so these are, zoom in a little bit. So these are like little radar plots, and how far out it sticks is based on the concentration. We had a client that did this for his BTEX organics at a refinery site. And you could see as you move down gradient across the refinery, these little warped squares were getting smaller and smaller moving down gradient. So I love graphics as a way to help understand projects. But I've kind of been cheating in a way by just showing the results. So let's actually go back into Enviro data, and we'll choose a selection set, which is two locations, a list of parameters, and I'm going to click on this button that says refresh selected data. So what that does is it takes what's on this form here and it turns it into a SQL statement, applies it to the normalized relational tables, downloads the selected data into a local data mart called selected data. There it's post-processed for unit conversion, reg limit comparison, value and flag processing, all that stuff. And then it's sitting in that table ready to be used, whether it's a graph or report, or in this case, we're going to use it to display some data in ArcGIS. So now I go back to ArcGIS, and I'm going to choose this graph wizard. And again, things about how the data is going to be drawn, where it's coming from, and all that. Now, this one has a second wizard screen, and this is to assign these things to scales. Now, these all fit fine on one scale, but if you need to do multiple scales, I want to compare iron to EH or something like that, you can do it. Then I just go to finish here, and it takes a second or two, and it draws them for me. And I'm going to zoom in a little bit on these. And you can see they're being drawn at the station locations. And so here are the values. Again, sulfate's doing great over time and that sort of thing. This is the other main reason why people get EnviroSpace. And same thing, they make the graphs in Excel, try to paste them at the right location on the map. So now we're going to look at one more thing, which is our Enviro portal tool. And find it here. So what happened was we had a client that wanted to display large amounts of data on a web map for the general public. And they didn't want them to have any software license or anything like that. So this has evolved over the years. And you select the data that you want, either on the side on this particular one, or we have one where you go into a page first and select the data you want. And then you can generate this on-screen map. It's a Google map with the locations of, in this case, soil borings there. And then these are being color coded by, in this case, they're being color coded by the station type. And then there also will have a dot down at the bottom. They're kind of too close to see them, but you can see down at the very bottom here, there's some green ones, which means that they're not exceeding, and then you'll find an occasional red one that's an exceedance. So great way of looking at the data. You can put other documents on there that people can get at, and so on. So I want to thank you for your time again. I appreciate your willingness to take a look at this and understand what we're doing. And if you want more information, please reach out to our website is www.geotech.com. I'm Dr. Dave at geotech.com, and we would welcome the opportunity to talk to you. Thank you very much, and have a nice day.